My name is Joel. First and foremost, I'll tell you about my family. Married to Hannah. We've been married 14 and a half years now. Then we have two children. Lucy is our 13-year-old and Jonah is our 11-year-old. So really blessed to have a wonderful family. Unfortunately, they're not here with me this week. Professionally, started out after college in social services. I was born and raised in the Chicago, Illinois area. And went into social services, first working with at-risk kids, so junior high age boys, 11 to 14-year-old boys from really rough backgrounds, home lives that involved violence, poverty, drugs, alcohol, things like that. Loved that, did that for a few years right out of college. After that is when I moved over to Germany and spent a little over 2 years in northwestern Germany working with adults with intellectual disabilities, and had a great experience there. I moved back to the United States and started working for a seminary in the Chicago area called Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and was raising money for them for about 6 years. And after that, went to where I am now, which is a place called Jill's House. As Sean mentioned, we provide services to families who are raising children with profound intellectual disabilities. We have about a $7 million budget at Jill's House. The vast majority of that comes through fundraising, so fundraising is a big part of my job. A real focus area, and if we're going to succeed and grow, that's something that we need to excel in. So it's something that I actually grew up around. My father was a fundraiser for his entire career. He most notably served at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. He was the head fundraiser there for over 20 years. So, we heard a lot of different reactions from dread to really loving fundraising. I was lucky enough to grow up around it, so it always seemed normal to me. And I think that was a big part of why I've embraced that as a part of my career. So anyways, I am here through Tuesday. I leave Wednesday. We have a short time here together today, and it's a big group. I hope that I'll be able to say some things that will be helpful for you. But I'm here, and I'd love to meet you and talk with you. So if you want to spend some time together in the next couple days, please feel free to seek me out, and I'd be happy to connect with you either during this week or beyond. I think contact info is in the app, emails, and things like that. So feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to connect. So before we get started talking about fundraising, I want to just get a few things out of the way. First of all, essentially all of the fundraising that I've done has taken place in America, so in an American context. So that's the perspective that I'll be speaking from. A lot of that will apply generally to everyone, and I know a lot of you probably do some fundraising in the United States, so that will definitely apply. But that's the perspective I'm coming from. That's the only one I can speak from. So you'll probably need to do a little bit of translation work to your perspective and your context. But I think hopefully most of it will carry over well. As we talked about our roles, some of you, fundraising has not been a part of that at all. Some of you have done quite a bit already, it sounds like. My role, as I mentioned, requires a lot of fundraising. So well over half my time is spent on the fundraising task. Not all of your jobs are structured that way, and I understand that. I have a lot of time to devote to it. Thankfully, we have such a great team that can handle so many of the other aspects. That frees me up to do a lot of fundraising. I realize that a lot of you are probably thinking, I've got a full-time job already. How on earth am I going to get to fundraising and to these donor relationships? So I understand that my situation might be different from yours. And then lastly, I really want this to be an interactive session. Please feel free to interrupt. I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation as well, but please don't hesitate to raise your hand, interrupt, and ask questions. I would love to hear from you and to learn from you as much as I hope to be able to impart some knowledge to you all. So we are going to take a moment before we dive in here. If you have a piece of paper or a computer or a phone or whatever, I want you to write down 5 names of key donors to your organization. Some of you may say, I don't know 5 donors at my organization. That's okay. But just take a minute here and write down the names of 5 people who come to mind who you would consider key donors to your organization. You don't have to share those names with anybody, obviously, but I'd just like you to take a minute to write them down, and then we're going to talk about them in a moment. Thanks for taking a moment to do that. One of the big joys of fundraising that I've experienced in my career is having these personal relationships, as someone mentioned, I think it was right here. with some of these key donors, people who are really invested in the organization, who are passionate about the mission, who have been around the mission for a long time, since the beginning in a lot of cases. And these relationships bring deep joy to me. They bring deep joy to our organization and are obviously, in a practical level, very, very important. And we'll talk about that in just a moment here. I want to share with you some alarming trends in the broader fundraising world. These trends are definitely true in the United States, and based on some of the research I did leading up to this, are true throughout Europe, generally speaking, as well. And these are some trends that should give us alarm as people who are tasked with bringing in money for our organizations. So, first trend, fewer people are giving to charity than at any time in the last 40 years. We're seeing this in America, certainly, and again, the research that I did, broadly speaking, has indicated that this is true throughout Europe as well. Fewer and fewer people are giving to charity. There's a lot of speculation as to why that might be, and there's some good research out there. We don't need to go into that now, but that is troubling. If fewer and fewer people are giving, that means that our donor pool, our potential donor pool, is shrinking. Not a good thing. Trust in institutions, broadly speaking, including in charities and religious organizations, churches, has been in decline for decades and continues to decline. There's a lot of skepticism about institutions out there, whether it's colleges and universities, whether it's churches, charities like the one I serve. People are more skeptical of who we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. The financial transparency, trust is declining. And it obviously is intuitive that when trust declines, it makes sense that fewer people would give. If they don't trust your organization to do right with their funds, they are going to be less inclined to give. So trust is declining. Number of households that are giving is declining. For most of us in this room, our fundraising goals only get bigger and bigger every year, right? That's definitely true for me. Every year that number seems to grow, and it's a higher bar that we need to clear each and every year. So when you put all that together, declining trust, declining number of donors, and bigger fundraising goals for all the amazing ministries that you all run, that is really troubling, and it is very worrisome. We talked about dread. This is a reason to dread fundraising, or these are reasons to dread fundraising. We should all be working to try and reverse these trends. We should be running organizations in a way that builds trust with more and more donors. We should be reaching out broadly and trying to get people who are not engaged in giving again. But not one of us in and of ourselves, and certainly not overnight, can reverse these trends. These trends are broad and they're decades in the making. So God hasn't given any one of us the ability to reverse those trends as far as I know. So what we need to do is to work around that and to learn how to work in this context. And so what does that mean for us? That means for us as fundraisers a few things. It means that now we are reliant on fewer donors for more dollars. And competition for those donors and those dollars is going to be very, very fierce, especially at the top end of the income spectrum. Those who have been given a lot, there is going to be a lot of competition for their dollars. One thing that I think is so critical to remember, we're talking about strategic relationships here for our organizations. When you're meeting with people who have that type of financial capacity, the higher end of financial capacity, you need to remember that you're one of probably 20 organizations that is trying to get their attention and trying to get them to invest their dollars in your mission, in your organization. There's going to be a lot of competition for fewer and fewer people, and we're trying to get more dollars. It means that we are more reliant on those, what I've called strategic donors. And that's, I consider strategic donors those who God has given much and who give generously. That's going to mean different things in different contexts. What a lot is, that could be, a gift of $1,000 a year, 1,000 euros a year. It could be 10,000. It could be much more or much less than any of those numbers. I don't know your context exactly or what your budgets look like. But you all are probably familiar with the old 80-20 rule, which is that 80% of your revenue is going to come from 20% of your donors. That very few donors are going to give the bulk of your revenue. It's probably more like a 95-5 rule right now, that you're going to get 95% of your revenue from 5% of your donors. That might not be true for your organization. Again, that makes you an exception, not the rule. We're seeing this trend accelerate, that a larger proportion of revenue is coming from fewer and fewer donors. So what does that mean for us? It means that it is imperative that we focus disproportionate time and attention on these strategic donors, and that we learn how to cultivate relationships with them and people like them. Simply put, without those folks whom God has given much and who want to invest generously in what they are passionate about and what God has put on their heart, we won't be able to achieve our goals or advance our missions without those people. So it is absolutely imperative that we know who they are, and that we focus our time and attention on them, and that we learn how to cultivate relationships with them. I want to pause right there because I can probably sense what's going through some people's heads right now, and I want to tell you what this does not mean. It does not mean that some donors are more important than others. God's economy is really different than ours. Every donor and every dollar matters to God, and they should matter to us, whether they're giving $1 a year or $1 million a year. We want to be grateful in equal measure, and we want to not overlook anyone who might be wanting to come alongside us. So it also means that we shouldn't overlook our small donors. We mentioned the smaller faithful donors. Those are wonderful people to have in the sphere of our organizations. And as we think about God's economy as well, we can think about our economy too. And someone mentioned earlier sacrificial giving. I think maybe it was over here too. In my experience, most gifts of $25 are given at greater personal sacrifice than most gifts of $25,000. And I think that's something really important to remember, not to despise those small checks that come in just because they don't make a big dent in your balance sheet, but to value those people, because there's a lot of heart and sacrifice in those gifts. There's a practical side to not ignoring those people as well, because most people who are going to write a check for $25,000 probably started out writing a check for $25. And so those people who are your small dollar donors today, not all of them, but some of them are going to have the capacity over time to become your strategic donors, to become key to your organization. So there's a very practical side to paying attention to everybody in your donor pool. A few things that this doesn't mean, a few more things that this doesn't mean. Wealthy people are not smarter or wiser than non-wealthy people. That's an easy mistake to make, to think because someone can write a big check to your organization that they have more insight into what will make you successful, what will make you more faithful. That might be true. Someone mentioned it earlier that you get to meet a lot of people who have had a lot of business success. I think it was right here. And oftentimes people through their business success will accumulate a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight. It doesn't make them right just because they can write a big check to your organization. That doesn't mean that we don't listen to them, but it just means that we need to be careful that we're not letting their wealth unduly influence what we're doing in our ministries. And along with that, it can be easy when you're fundraising, especially with high dollar donors, to let our hearts get a little bit lured away from our ministry by wealth and all that goes with it. And I'll just give you a few examples of that. I meet with pretty wealthy donors on a regular basis. I get invited to a lot of fancy dinners. I get to play golf at some of the nicest golf courses in America. In fact, my sweatshirt I just got last week in Dallas at one of a very private golf course, which was a ton of fun. And I enjoy those things, and there's nothing inherently wrong with those things. But it can be easy for me to focus on the pleasures of being around people with wealth as opposed to the purpose of being around these people, the shared purpose of gospel ministry that we've been talking about here. Okay, so those are some things, again, with the point, if you take one thing away from this talk today, is that I really feel convicted that in order for our missions to succeed, we need to pay disproportionate attention to people who have been given much and who are looking to be generous towards God. Again, not to the detriment of other people, but I just don't see any way that we can succeed in our missions without doing that. And so I want to talk about some practical ways that we can cultivate these relationships. Well, I want to share a few things that have worked for me in my career, and I think will hopefully help you a little bit. There's certainly more to say. What I'm about to say is not exhaustive. This is not everything there is to say, but these are a few principles and key activities that I think have been really helpful. Just a little bit of context. I mentioned we have about a $7 million budget at my current organization. The vast majority of that comes through fundraising. There's probably about 100 to 150 key relationships and 20 really key relationships that make us sink or swim. If we're going to be successful in any given year, it's those 20 relationships and then maybe 100 more after that that really make the difference for us. So even on a budget of $7 million, which isn't massive, but it's not small either. Again, I don't know where you all are at and what the size of your organizations are, but it's those very few small amount of people who make an outsized difference. We have about 4,000 donors in any given year. So the other 3,900, I am so grateful for them, and we do a lot to steward and care for them and thank them as well. But a lot of my time goes into those 100, 120, maybe 150 people, something like that. So I want to make one point, and a lot of you said, fundraising isn't your main role, and that's okay. But I think one mistake that we can make, and one thing that we is thinking that these types of relationships, these donor interactions, are a distraction from our ministry. We all want to be doing gospel ministry of whatever kind it is. We want to be serving the people that God has called us to serve. And it's easy to think that that's the main thing. And there's this fundraising thing over here, and I'll get to it if I have time, but it's really distracting me from what I actually have to do. Or you think of fundraising as a necessary evil. It's something we have to do because we have to get money in the door so we can keep operating, so we can make payroll. And you just view it as something distasteful, but something that has to be done. So you grit your teeth and you bear it. I would really encourage you not to see these types of relationships, these donor interactions, as aside from your ministry or apart from your ministry, but as a core part of your ministry. Not all that there is, but when you are engaging people at a deep, deep level in the work that you're doing, you are enriching them, and it is a big part of their life, and it's a big part of your organization's life, and that is so critical to your ministry. So my first encouragement would be just maybe a little bit of a mindset shift for some of you. It's not the ministry's over here and fundraising's over here, or fundraising is a necessary evil, but it is all one thing. And part of what God has called you to do is to be in relationship with people who have the capacity to make an outsized difference for your organization. So, viewed that way, that changes the way, hopefully, that you structure your time. I hope it means that you're carving out time in your calendar each and every week to do things like say thank you to donors, to report back on impact, to have those face-to-face meetings. Those are critical things, and if we leave those until the last thing on our to-do list, it's very likely that we're not going to get to them, and that's going to hurt our organizations in the long term. So I really encourage you first and foremost just to view this as part and parcel of your mission and your ministry, that this is something that God has entrusted you with, and He wants you to do it well and do it with excellence. And I think if you approach it that way, it'll make it a lot easier, and I think, as we've talked about, you'll find joy in these relationships, and you'll find that they are more life-giving than they are detracting, and it'll move your ministry forward in ways you probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. So relationships are a critical part of your ministry. They're not next to your ministry. They're not under your ministry. They are your ministry. Another fundamental concept, there is no substitute for time and patience. There is no shortcut to a deep relationship with someone. It is often going to take years to develop these kinds of relationships. I was reading some data not too long ago, and again, this is in an American context, but the average seven-figure gift, so $1 million gift, the average seven-figure gift given to an organization in the United States only comes after 8 consecutive years of giving. So 8 years of consecutive giving to be in a place where they know the people, where they trust the organization, where they can then make a large investment. Similarly, for planned giving, so giving out of people's estates after they've passed away, it's usually an estate commitment is made after 15 years of consecutive giving. So we can tend to think about our fundraising goals in terms of 12 months. What do we need to do to make budget this year? What do we need to do to hit our goals? But our donors tend not to think about it that way. They're thinking over the long term. And so we need to adjust our thinking as well and put in the time and be patient and let these relationships develop over years. I don't know how long you all have been at in your roles and at your various ministries, but the longer you're there, usually the more effective you can be in fundraising because people have had the opportunity to get to know you. They hopefully like you. They trust you, and they know that you're going to do well with what they're investing in your organization. And so there is just nothing that I know of that can speed up that process or that can be a shortcut to the kinds of relationships and the kinds of investment that we're talking about. So there should be an encouraging side to that as well, which is if that big gift doesn't show up in the year you're hoping it to show up, that's okay. Be patient with your donors, and if you're alongside them for the long haul, they'll be alongside you for the long haul. So just think in terms of years. Don't think in terms of just what do I need to do in the next, to hit my budget this year or to get that gift this year. I'd really encourage you to be patient. I think you'll see a lot of fruit that you might not otherwise see if you're patient with your donors. And again, feel free to interrupt if you have questions. Happy to take those. Another big one, and we've touched on this, is get to know them holistically. Don't just get to know them as an ATM machine. Don't just get to know them as someone who's interested in your organization. But I would really encourage you to shoot for a real holistic, fully orbed relationship with these people who are in your organization's orbit. And I want you to think about just one person or two people on the list that you made earlier. And I want you to imagine a situation in which you sit down with them and neither of you are allowed to talk about your organization. What would you talk about? Would you have anything to talk about? And just think about that for a second. If you couldn't talk about your ministry, if you couldn't talk about your church, if you couldn't talk about what God was doing in and through your organization, picture that donor right now, what would you two be talking about? And if the answer is not much, don't despair. It just means you've got some work to do. It means you need to get to know them as whole people. Similarly, I'd encourage you don't have to do it right now. In fact, don't do it right now, but maybe sometime later tonight, if you have a few minutes, go and check your text messages and your email correspondence with some of those key donors that you've had over the last 6 months or a year. Have they all been about your work, or have they been about other things? Did you ever check in on anybody who might be sick? Did you ever ask about how someone's kids are doing? What does that communication look like? And if it just is about your organization, that should be a red flag for you. Again, don't despair. There's plenty that you can do. But you should think about how can I get to know this person in a way that allows us to talk about things that aren't what I'm doing day in and day out in my work. Someone, I think, initially mentioned just how passionate these people are about your organizations, which is absolutely true. But they've got a lot of other passions and interests too. And we shortchange ourselves and them and the relationship if we only focus on just talking about work stuff, so to speak. A few other questions you can ask yourself as you think about the people on your list and others who you would like to be on that list. Do you know their kids' names? Do you know what their grandkids' names? Do you know where they grew up? Do you know what their childhood circumstances were? Do you know what their parents did for work? Do you know what they do for fun? Do you know what hobbies and interests they have? Do you know how they got on the career path that they're on? Do you know what other ministries are important to them? Again, I mentioned there's a lot of competition for donors and dollars and more. You can be sure if you're visiting a couple and they're significant donors to your organization, that there are, again, 20 other people from 20 other organizations trying to get their same time and attention. Do you know what their real passions are? Or are you so focused on getting them interested in your work that you're not exploring that? Do you know why they care about your ministry? A lot of times it's easy just to assume that we know that they care or why they care, and I think it's a really interesting activity to ask more in depth about why they care about this particular ministry. Why did they start giving? What led to that first $25 gift way back when? Again, if you don't have answers to these questions as you think about these people, then you don't have to despair. It's not a big deal, but I would encourage you the next time you're with these people and having those personal meetings, focus on these other things. If you can have a meeting, I actually tell our fundraising team at Jill's House this, if you can have a meeting with a donor and not talk about Jill's House at all, that means you've done your work really, really well. Where you're just talking about whatever it might be, family, work, culture, news, it could be anything. It could just be fun. But that means that they've done their job building that relationship really, really well if they can make it a whole meeting without talking about our ministry. Back to communication, another point. So we talked about getting to know them holistically. So in my experience, communicating frequently is really important and personally. And we've touched on both of those things. Especially for people who are highly successful in the business world or whatever it might be, they tend to be very busy people. Their time is very tight. Their time is very valuable. And as I mentioned, there's probably 20 other fundraisers trying to get some of that time and attention. So I would say communicate with them frequently, but do it succinctly. So one way I do that at Jill's House that's been very effective, I send out a short email update every week. I have there's actually a lot of people on the list, but certainly the 120 or 150 that make a difference, but there's probably 1,000 people on that list. I send out a quick update every week. I make sure I read through it after I write it, that it can be read in no more than 60 seconds. So it is a brief update. It's not a newsletter. It's not, you don't have to crank out a nice brochure or an article. People are likely just to not read that because they are busy and it's easy to not read. But I include a quote from a parent who we recently served or an anecdote about one of the kids we serve, something new that's happening, but something frequent that's regular and brief. If they don't want to read it this week, that's fine. They can read about it next week. But I think you want to be top of mind with donors. Again, they are hearing from a lot of people, but if you can communicate frequently enough about what's going on in your ministry, what's going on with your church, what's going on with your organization in a way that they can easily digest, I think it can be really powerful. I hear so frequently, I'm actually shocked about how many people actually read these emails I sent. I figured for the longest time it was only my mom who read them, but when I'm out there meeting with donors, they all almost universally say, thank you so much for sending these updates. I love hearing about that. Or sometimes it'll spur questions from them. When I meet with them, they'll say, hey, I remember reading that update a few months ago. Can you tell me more about that? So frequently and succinctly. Nobody needs more to read. Nobody needs more to do. But if you can do something that they can digest easily and that will keep you on their mind, it will help improve that relationship. And it will do a lot of the legwork for you so that when you're with them, you don't feel like you have to update them on everything that's happened because they are updated on everything that's happened. And you can talk about more substantive things. I will say one of the top complaints we hear from donors is the only time you reach out to me is when you want what? Money, right? So communicating frequently, communicating succinctly helps get past that we have been reaching out to you. We've been trying to keep you updated. We are checking in on you, and it's not about an ask, and it's not a prelude to an ask. This is just an ongoing relationship, and we're communicating with you about what God is doing in and through our organization. One other thing I would encourage you to do, especially with these people who you get to know well over time, is communicate with them about things that don't have anything to do with their organization. Find things to talk about that aren't your organization, and you will find that the relationship becomes much, much richer. So if you know that such and such a donor is in whatever business area it might be, and you're reading the newspaper one morning and there's an interesting article about that field, send that link to your donor real quick. Just send a 2-sentence email. Dear so-and-so, I just read this article this morning. I thought about you, thought you might find it interesting. Best, Joel. Done. And it takes you 30 seconds. And what that signals to them is this person thinks about me. This person knows something about me, thought enough to maybe add value to my life. I get to read this article and maybe there's something interesting in there for the donor, right? Add value to their lives. find ways to communicate them that aren't necessarily just about your organization. It could be about their kids. I sent an email, well, not about kids, but one of our key donors, he gave us $250,000 last year. His wife is going through chemotherapy right now. And I just sent him a note to say, thinking about her and just want to see if there are any updates. And he wrote right back and gave me an update. If you can find ways to communicate with people, again, about things that aren't your ministry, you'll find that the relationship becomes much, much richer, and that will pay dividends for you. Another point, I would say, and I hope you all do this, and it's, again, not groundbreaking, but it's important, is proactively solicit their feedback, and especially their critical, their negative feedback. And why is that important? One, you'll learn a lot when you ask people questions. You'll learn a lot about your organization and about how they perceive it. And if you're not asking those questions, especially inviting critical feedback, negative feedback, people will be very unlikely to share it. So what are some ways to do that? Here's some questions that you can ask when you're together, or you can send an email in advance of a meeting and say, hey, here are some questions I'd love for you to consider, to think about, and let's discuss when we meet. Here's some good questions to ask. Where have we fallen short as an organization in your estimation? These people very often have been with the organization since the beginning or for a long time. They know it well. They've observed it from a distance. And ask them not just to tell you what they think is awesome about your organization. It's easy to talk about the victories, right? Ask them where they think you might have fallen a little bit short, where you could have done better. You'll be surprised what great information you learn from donors and from their perspectives. And it will give them such a freedom. They will feel freed because they're allowed to share what they actually think instead of just having to tell you how awesome your organization is and what you're doing. You'll learn a lot through that. A similar question, when have you been most disappointed in our ministry? Was there something that happened in the past or currently is happening that disappointed you? And let's talk about that. Again, you'll learn a lot and you'll be able to address their concerns. And I think a lot of times having that open, honest conversation unlocks deeper and deeper giving. Maybe a little bit of a positive spin on those questions. If there's one way we can improve this year, what would it be? What's something we could do differently? What's something we could do more? What's something we could stop doing? And again, more on a positive side, maybe sending an email saying, dear so-and-so, would it be all right if I sent you some of our plans for the next 12 months and you could review it, and next time we're together, we could talk about that. I'd love your feedback on that. Inviting people to the inside of your organization, making them feel like insiders. Again, it's going to be really good. You're going to learn a lot that you didn't know before. You're going to get insight that you didn't have before. It's going to make you better at doing what you're doing, and it's going to unlock a much deeper relationship with these people. So I'd really encourage you to be proactive about that. People are not typically going to offer those types of perspectives. They're not going to offer their opinions, especially if they're negative, or if they've been disappointed, they're not going to offer that. You need to draw that out of them. And if you do, I talked about the 20 other fundraisers who are trying to get their attention. It will set you apart from those 20 other fundraisers. They will think about you in a very different category as someone they can have an open, honest conversation with, as opposed to it just being more propaganda about whatever your organization is. So proactively solicit feedback, especially negative feedback. And then this is the last one, and I know we're short on time here, and we'll be done soon. Don't be shy about talking about money. These people know why you're there. They know what God has given them, and they know what your organization needs. Obviously, you need to talk with them about specifics, but it can be very easy as fundraisers to fall into the trap I like to call the ready, aim, 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 aim trap. It should be ready, aim, fire. We need to ask. God's given us the duty and the privilege to ask. It's our responsibility to do that. It's not a bad thing. It's not an ungodly thing to ask people to share their resources. In fact, it's very often one of the biggest favors that you can do them to help them find deeper joy and to be obedient to God with what He's given them. Again, most people, they're expecting you to ask. They want you to ask. That might not be true of everybody. I can think of a few couples I work with where asking would be the worst thing you could do. But for most couples that I work with, they want to be asked. So what are some ways to approach that? One, be clear in your intentions. A lot of times when I set up a meeting, I will say specifically, I want you to know going into this meeting, I'm not going to ask you for anything, so that we take that off the table right away. So that takes all the pressure out of the meeting. Or if I am going to ask, usually what I'll do is ask for permission to do so. Prior to that, say, dear so-and-so, when we meet, would it be all right if I presented you with a proposal for giving for this year? If they say yes, that'd be fine, great. Now I've got permission. If they say, no, now's not the right time, that's great too, because that leads to a deeper conversation about what would the right time be, or are there other things that we need to do before to make that the right time. So be clear in your intentions. Don't try to surprise anyone. And again, similar to what I said about asking them how often they want to hear from you, let them dictate the relationship. Let them determine the time, place, and manner of the ask. Question you could ask them, what's the best way for me to talk with you about your giving? Ask them. Let them tell you what the best way is, whether they want an email, whether they want it done face-to-face. Or you could ask, when would be a good time for us to talk specifically about their giving? They might say, let's talk about it right now. If so, you need to be prepared to talk about it right then. Or they may say, now's not good, business is bad, can we talk again in 6 months when things have turned around? Let them lead the relationship. One thing I mentioned before, a great question to ask. With your permission, could I send you something to consider that we could discuss next time we meet? If you put them in the driver's seat and allow them to steer the relationship, it's going to make it much less stressful for everyone. And it's going to, again, distinguish you from the other 20 fundraisers who are trying to get that ask in when they want, not when the donor wants. One other thing on this, and I've been doing this quite a long time now, obviously if you are going to ask, don't be unrealistic in the ask that you're going to make, but don't be afraid to go big and challenge people either. You'd be surprised, whatever number you ask for, and Sean, you mentioned the specificity earlier, whatever number you name when you put it in there in the ask, that's the highest they're going to go. I have yet in my fundraising career to ask for $100,000 and get a gift of $200,000. Very often I'll ask for $100,000 and I'll get 50. But if you, that's the ceiling, is the number that you name. So don't be afraid to go big. Don't be offensive. And if they say no, don't be offended or hurt or make them feel less than. Generally, if you've asked for too much, they'll just say, I can't do that, but I can do this. So don't be afraid to go big. You'd be surprised what that would unlock. And I mentioned this earlier, but I'll just reinforce it here. Commit to people for the long term. I'll get to you in 1 second. Commit to these relationships for the long term. Again, we can get so wrapped up in our 12-month budgets that we don't forget to think that these donors have been with us for 10, 15, 20 years, and they're hopefully going to be with us for another 20 years. And we need to look at that lifespan, not just the 12 months. So commit to these people through the ups and downs of their lives, financial and otherwise, and they will commit to you. I guarantee it will pay dividends. Just because someone can't give a gift this year doesn't mean they're not going to give a big gift next year. And if you commit to them for the long term, you will see that pay dividends. So what I would encourage you to do with those list of 5 people that you made at the beginning here, sometime this week, and I'm happy to help you with this if you want the help, write their name down and write one thing that you're going to do in the next 30 days to deepen that relationship with those 5 people. It could be a phone call, it could be an email, it could be a meeting, whatever it might be, one action step, 5 people, 30 days. That's a doable task, and I guarantee it will help move things forward.